Hi, everyone. Welcome to the SITE webinar series, a venue where we hope to provide professional development opportunities for our members on topics that are informative and current to our field, which is focused on technology and teacher education. Hi, my name is Denise Crawford, and I'm the president of SITE, and I welcome you to our Spring 2018 webinar hosted by several members of our social media SIG. I would especially like to personally thank our social media SIG co-chairs, Dan Krutka and Ben Gleason, for their leadership in organizing this webinar focused on social media and education. The goal of SITE as an organization is really to promote the development and dissemination of professional practice and research. A webinar is just one mechanism SITE uses to reach out to our membership and the teacher education community. We hope that you are planning to attend our annual conference, which will be held in Washington, D.C. on March 26th through the 30th. We have an exciting list of keynotes, invited speakers, workshops, and sessions. Please join us in D.C. This webinar series is the result of the work and coordination coming out of two of our SITE councils, the Information Technology Council and the Teacher Education Council. This SITE webinar topic was selected by our Teacher Education Council leadership team. It is my pleasure to introduce the chair for the Teacher Education Council, Liz Landgren, and Assistant Chair, Jake Cohen, who will introduce our speakers for today's SITE seminar. Enjoy.
Thanks, Denise. I'm Liz Langren, Chair of the Teacher Education Council, as Denise mentioned, and I'm pleased to welcome everybody to this webinar. So the Teacher Education Council is this grouping of special interest groups, or SIGs, that are especially focused on teacher education. And there's always such great energy at SITE, so I'm really glad to see we're exploring ways to keep the conversation going in between conferences. It's also a way for us to highlight some of the great work our SIGs are engaged in. And so we've got a great group today. I think you'll enjoy hearing from them. And so I'd like to turn it over to Jake Cohen, who's the Assistant Chair for TEC, the Teacher Education Council, to introduce our first speakers.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm Jake Cohen, as she said, the Assistant Chair of the Teacher Education Council, and we're all very pleased that you could join us today for the SITE Teacher Education webinar. The decision to have research and social media be the topic for this Teacher Ed Council webinar was an easy one. The Social Media SIG is our newest Teacher Ed Council SIG, and they're doing some really interesting work. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers for today. We're going to begin with Dan Krutka and Ben Gleason, who are our SITE Social Media SIG chairs, and then later we'll hear from Jeff Carpenter, Tanya Doucet, and Spencer Greenhall. So take it away, Dan and Ben.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Krutka. I am a assistant professor of curriculum and instruction at University of North Texas.
Good morning. My name is Benjamin Gleason, and I am also an assistant professor at Iowa State University.
And so this morning, what we'd like to do is just share a little bit about some of the work that our SIG is doing and that's happening around social media and education. We're really excited to have started this SIG because, as far as we know, there's no other organization that focuses explicitly on how social media is studied, taught, and examined in teacher education and even in K-12 education. And this is kind of fruition of the last couple years of discussions that a number of our the members of SITE have been having. So if that's a plug for SITE, that going to SITE can connect you with people who are interested in different educational technology issues. And SITE is also a great venue for a lot of the work of our SIG members with the couple different journals they have, J-Tate and SITE, which are the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education and Contemporary Issues in Technology and Teacher Education are both good venues for the work that our SIG has been doing. And so what we'd like to do is, you guys, talk a little bit about, again, the work that different members are doing and that's happening in the field in general. But we'd first like to start by kind of sharing our origin story. Again, we're a new SIG that started at the most recent SITE convention that happened in Austin, Texas last spring. And so Ben, do you want to help us get started with the story?
Sure. So picture the scene. So picture a beautiful March day in Austin, Texas, beautiful sun shining, a group of engaged social scholars who have known each other or have gotten to know each other through social media and are maybe meeting for the first time in a very fun and exciting site conference. We get together outside and we decide that there's a real need for scholarship that is using these tools, that is pursuing research that is aimed at improving teaching and learning in the K-12 and higher education sector. And so we start scribbling down ideas on a napkin. And eventually this kind of napkin manifesto turns into a more organized, I'm going to keep the word manifesto, and motivated and inspired by a small group of engaged scholars and social media researchers. We take our half-brained ideas to the SIG Council, where is it eventually approved. But yeah, I think the important thing to remember with that story is that great ideas can happen anywhere. B, the site conference was a really meaningful place for the exchange of ideas and kind of relationship building. And so there was something special and something magical that I feel like we felt there at the conference. I think a lot of these professional working relationships had developed on social media over the years, but there is something kind of engaging and inspiring and motivating about meeting in person. And so it seemed very natural to want to start that group.
And if I could add in too, we had a great group of people from all over the United States. To give credit, I think Holly Marich was part of that first paper bag writing session. Brett Willett, I think, was there. But a lot of members, like from Tori Trust to Matt Kaler to Josh Rosenberg, Nandita Gurjar. We had a lot of great people who showed up at that first meeting and helped us get going. But Ben, the thing I remember about that meeting the most is it reminded me, it's kind of like we all had an interest in social media. And that's kind of one of the benefits of social media is you're often able to find others with similar affinities as you. And so I kind of see how the site conference serves a similar function to social media spaces where people have a common interest. And a lot of people from Henry Jenkins to others have written about how fan cultures and other things evolve and emerge because people have similar interests. And we were allowed to do that at the site conference. But I think we had a lot of questions about how that translated to education. And not many people were asking those questions. And I think that's kind of the purpose of the SIG. Anything else to add, Ben, that I missed?
No, I think those are really good points. Yeah, I feel like I feel like there has been. I feel like we're just beginning now to have these really good conversations about what high quality teaching and learning looks like using social media, and it's getting so complex, especially with things like how we can best serve our students in a time when not only social media can support all of the collaborative, creative, kind of curatorial things that we've all written about in our scholarship, but how can we continue to use social media in a time when social media itself is almost presenting many challenges for effective and pro-social kind of consequences. So it's just, things are becoming a lot more complicated and complex. And so I personally feel very supported just by being in this group and thinking about these really complex questions that are that really require a good group of engaged scholars to work through. These issues are way too complex and are just require a kind of broad range of methodologies. I think that was also one of the impetuses, or there's the impetus for the creation of the SIG as well. You know, we all bring different strengths, and so we will also hear about the methodologies and yeah, just the different directions that each of us bring.
And so with that, we would like to feature some different, you know, members of our SIG and some of the work that they're doing. And so without further delay, we will turn it over to Jeff Carpenter.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you to CITE for the invitation, and thank you to Dan and Ben for your leadership of the SIG. I'm excited about its creation. So my name is Jeff Carpenter. I'm an associate professor of education and director of the Teaching Fellows program at Elon University, which is in North Carolina. Before moving into teacher education, I was a high school English and ESOL teacher for 10 years in Japan, Honduras, Boston, Virginia, and also in North Carolina. I'm not a technologist originally, so my research interest is teacher learning. I figured out early in my career that teaching is really hard, and we need to learn how to get better at it as we're doing it. I also learned early in my career that it's very hard to learn how to get better at teaching when you're isolated by yourself. And isolation has been one of the defining characteristics of the teaching profession since its inception almost. So I was casting about for a new line of research and sort of stumbled serendipitously upon the fact that some educators were using Twitter to reach out beyond their schools and districts to find other educators to network with and share resources with and collaborate with. And I got interested in that and started to investigate it and had my teacher education students doing stuff with Twitter. And as social media can do, as Dan alluded to, it sort of connects people with similar interests. And so Dan and I stumbled across each other. He also had his students doing stuff with social media. And we decided, let's do a survey. And so we put a survey out there to the Twitterverse and asked teachers, how are you using Twitter and why are you using Twitter? And this was early days of education Twitter. And so graciously, a lot of teachers responded to our survey. It's harder now to get people to respond, but a lot of people responded. And so Dan and I published some of the early research on how educators use Twitter to sort of combat the various forms of isolation that are endemic to the profession. In terms of sort of new areas of research that I'll be presenting some on at CITE and just areas that I'm exploring and thinking about is multi-platform research or research that delves into multiple social media. So we have started to, the literature now does feature a good number of studies that investigate single social media tools. And those are very helpful to the field, and they're important. And that depth of understanding with individual tools is critical. But educators don't learn professionally in one way. So educators combine learning sources of different formats. And so I think that if the field is limited to only single platform or single tool research, we're going to miss some things that are probably important to understanding how teachers can learn via social media and beyond. And so one of the things that I'll be presenting at CITE is on the combination of Twitter and the mobile instant messaging app Voxer. And so how teachers and educators combine those two platforms. Twitter is, I think, as most of us know, very open, and Voxer provides a little bit more of a private space. And sometimes there's educators, all educators sometimes need to have conversations that are perhaps best not had on the public platform of Twitter. So if you need to discuss a particular student's behavior or get feedback on a difficult interaction with a parent or an administrator, Twitter's probably not the place for that. So I'm investigating sort of these social media repertoires that educators may develop in order to take advantage of different affordances that different platforms have, and also the limitations of some of those platforms. So also I've got a line of research going on the Global Read Aloud, which is a teaching and learning project, which again, teachers use to connect with classrooms outside their schools and districts in the reading of a common text. And they use multiple media to do that. So it's not all via Twitter or all via Skype. They're using multiple platforms. And so I think that there's a lot of room in the field for additional research that takes this multi-platform approach and looks at maybe the larger learning ecologies that educators do their professional learning in.
Okay, we'll now turn it to our next person. Thank you, Jeff. And let's turn it to Tanya.
Hello, everyone. I am Tanya Doucet, and I'm an assistant professor of learning sciences at the University of Idaho. My background is as an educator as well, but it was in agricultural education. So that was my licensure from Texas. I find it awesome that I connect with so many folks who are in Texas now, like Dan, but aren't Texan. And I'm the one running around in the Great White North being the Texan. So we have a lot of fun talking about our social media research. And I've been often an early adopter of social media. I looked it up one day because I was curious. I started my Twitter account 4 months after the platform launched. Didn't know I was that much of an early adopter. But it made sense for me to start using social media as a tool in my teaching and trying to be the ever smart, work smarter, not harder academic. Where I teach should also be where I research, so I can fit these two tools together. In this case, I've actually worked with pre-service teachers at the University of Wyoming, my previous appointment as an assistant professor, where I actually asked our students to engage in Twitter chats. I wasn't necessarily certain at the time what I was asking the students to do, but this has truly developed into an interesting space that has had long-lasting benefits for my students. Many of them found that it helped them with getting jobs 3 years later as they were graduating with their teaching degrees. They had already connected with some of these administrators that they were interviewing with on social media. So it just made sense to kind of follow this line of inquiry. One of the first major studies I was working on actually has been joint with Oklahoma State. I've been working with Alicia Baker, a recent graduate from their doctoral program, Scott Hazelwood, who's been very active in Oklahead, and Dr. Tutalani Asino. So we wanted to do a tale of two Twitter chats, or any given Sunday, because both of the states were hosting their Twitter chats on Sundays about an hour apart. So it created an interesting look for us out west, in the wild, wild west, where many of us may assume that it's a rural state, so they don't necessarily have access to or use social media. What we helped identify and show was that nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, Wyoming was the first state to offer professional teacher credit for participating in Twitter chats. And it is an honor to say that I got to help champion that cause. I worked directly with the Wyoming Department of Education, with our Wyoming Ed Chat leader at the time, James Capty, and we put together the paperwork to get this through, and how do we track it? So we've been looking at these questions of how do teachers participate in Twitter chats? How does that inform their practice? And some of the things that we've been finding, these provide immediate spaces professional development. They can hear about a new tool, or they can get an in-depth look at a tool on a Sunday evening, and then Monday morning start playing with it in their classroom, or start using whatever it was we talked about. We would try to tie the different chats depending on what individual moderators were doing, because we would try to spread the love, if you will, and we would get moderators from different schools around the state, or we would bring in guest moderators from out of state to talk about their experiences. The other project that I've recently started working on with George Fletzianos and Patrick Lowenthal and Royce Kimmons and Larson at BYU. We've been looking at comment sentiment on educational videos. In particular, we wanted to look at TEDx and TED Ed Talks on YouTube. We often encourage our students to use these videos in their courses when they're working with their learners. But can you embed the video, or do you have to go to YouTube? And then do the students see the comments? On the flip side, as we develop the master teacher, when they're in our master's programs and our doc programs, and we encourage them to take a larger platform and speak at these kinds of events, do we really know what we're asking them to do and what they're getting into? Because interestingly enough, depending on the topic, and if the gender of the speaker is female, that will change the comments and the sentiment analysis that we conducted. So if you are a female, be prepared for highly polarized comments, either extremely positive or extremely negative. And as you might assume, negativity breeds negativity. So once the comments turn toxic, it's just a snowball from there. So these are things that we really want to consider as we work with our students and with our teachers as they use these tools in their professional environments.
Great, thank you so much, Tanya. Let's now move to Spencer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Spencer Greenhall. I am a former French teacher. My first degree is in French teaching from Brigham Young University, where I also got the chance to teach 100-level French classes for a couple years. That was a lot of fun, but I always had an interest in educational technology. And so I made my way to Michigan State University, where I am now a PhD candidate in the Educational Psychology and Educational Technology program. I'm also an instructor for the Master of Arts in Educational Technology program that we have here at MSU. And the MAET program is actually the genesis of my social media research. One of my colleagues and I, so Josh Rosenberg, also a PhD candidate here at MSU, we were both really impressed with the way that our online master's program was using Twitter as a space for affinity, as Dan and Ben were talking about earlier. There were Twitter hashtags associated with different courses, as well as a hashtag associated with the program in general. And these were just amazing to see how some students were really using this to go above and beyond what we were asking them to do as instructors and turning it into a real space where affinity and community existed. And around the same time, I happened to read an article about a magic Google spreadsheet that would collect tweets using particular search terms. And I said, well, a hashtag is a search term, and these hashtags that are associated with our program are really, really interesting. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could collect some of these tweets and then study them? And so we started doing that. And the direction I've ended up going in based on these initial experiences is what I like to call digital research methods based on digital traces. Essentially, all these great uses of Twitter and other social media that we've been talking about, they leave something behind. And depending on how open or closed the system is, a researcher can access these traces that are left behind, collect them, sometimes in very large numbers, and study them in a way that researchers typically haven't been able to study them before. So this is a very interesting vein of research. There are new complications and new questions that come out of it, but it's also interesting to be able to jump into these hashtags that have been created as affinity spaces for teachers and educators of all kinds, and to be able to see what people are leaving behind in a very naturalistic, authentic way, and then take these authentic artifacts of educator practice in these public social media spaces and try to connect back to theories of social learning, the affinity space theory, communities of practice, see how these build up the theories, but then also invite us to stretch these theories and continue evolving our understanding of what it means to teach and learn in an online space. And so my future work is looking at continuing these veins of research. My dissertation work, which I'm hoping to complete very soon, is looking at different teacher hashtags and trying to take the attributes of communication between them and other attributes of community, and to try to distinguish them from each other, to see how these hashtags differ from each other, if they differ from each other in terms of community interactions and social interactions, just to show that Twitter is a wonderfully complex social tool that is used by some groups in some ways, for example, in ways that emphasize resource sharing, but then is used in different ways by other groups where they may actually put more value on conversations than sharing links with each other. And being able to do this at scale with over 1 million tweets from over 50 different hashtags is a wonderful opportunity that I'm really excited about. And then seeing what other kind of traces are being left behind. Sometimes tweets are associated with geographic data. And considering that some Twitter hashtags are associated with geographic places, it's interesting to be able to use these new kinds of data to look at the geographic dynamics that are happening within these hashtags. So it's an exciting world. I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, such as those who have already talked before me, but it's exciting to be able to see what we can do with these data and what we can do next in the field.
Thanks, Spencer. Ben.
Okay, thank you, Spencer. Well, this is so great. One of the reasons why I love doing these webinars, and one of the reasons why I love the social media SIG, is by learning about all the connections that we have. So just by listening to your stories about how you got started and your collaborators, I'm finding that we have many things in common. So like Jeff, I want to share a little bit of my background. So I also was a high school teacher as well as a teacher for English language learners, both in California and Guatemala, both high school as well as university students. So my interest in social media, my interest in Twitter, my interest in looking at how young people and kind of working professionals are using social media comes from my own kind of interest as well. So I first got started with this as academic research back in 2011 when the Occupy movement was happening. So I was living in the Bay Area at the time, and so I was really involved, or I was following along with the Occupy movement there. And so I think that was the first place when I began to see the Occupy movement and the creation of the hashtag, both the hashtag Occupy as well as hashtag OWS, as a space for not only mobilizing social movements, but also sharing information that was going beyond just sort of tactical, oh, we're going to protest on this corner, but sharing the reasons behind the movement, sharing the history of the movement, making connections to other social movements. So it was really in the space that I began to see something fascinating happen. And so that turned into my dissertation work, which explored many of the assumptions that I had. So what I saw from the Occupy movement was fascinating sharing of research from multiple perspectives, which was aimed at kind of countering these dominant social narratives about kind of what a waste of time the Occupy movement is. They have no demands, you know, what is it for? And so I came into this work with all these assumptions, and like Tanya, I found out that I was pretty wrong in a lot of my assumptions. So that was fascinating, and that began a 3-year study of how young people use Twitter as a way of developing authentic and emerging literacy practices, as a way of exploring identity, as well as a way of developing potentially humanizing relationships with their teachers. So some of the people that I've worked with in the past include the 3 people you see on the screen right now. Christine Greene is on top. She's from Michigan State University, and our collaboration is ongoing, and I think it's maybe 5 years now, 6 years. So I continue to learn from her, learn with her. That I also continue to explore social media in higher education. So the middle picture, you see my colleague Larissa Nadolny from Iowa State University, who also has done game-based learning. And so our work together looks at how we can use social media as a way of not only supporting learning for pre-service teachers, but also as a way of potentially breaking down these large lecture classes into smaller sort of community practice in which the pre-service teachers develop identity, forge new relationships with the content, and sort of contribute to a knowledge base. The third sphere is digital citizenship. So the bottom picture is my colleague Sam Von Gillern, who went to Iowa State, and now he is at Texas A&M. And so this work continues with a lot of the themes that I was interested with the Occupy movement. So seeing participation in a social media space as a kind of learning, we explore how to support digital citizenship efforts that use social media and that also tie kind of the offline, very traditional ideas of what citizenship is. So traditional civic education, things like voting, become a member of community-based organizations, and then merging that with some of the online social media facilitated citizenship. So things like online membership, online information sharing, things like that. So I'm very excited to be continuing a lot of these threads. And I think for me, social media is not only a way of making connections with all these fascinating scholars, but really allows our own kind of authentic interest to bubble up and to serve as the bridge to various affinity spaces. So I look forward to continuing to work with all of you. And I am, I'm fascinated because I feel like there's so much that I don't know that this is going to be definitely a learning experience for me as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm Dan Krutka. I'm at the University of North Texas. And Jeff kind of told the story of kind of one of the ways I really got into social media research. I was a high school social studies educator when I did my PhD. It was really on civic education was really my concern. And but like one of the first opportunities I had after I had my first university job was there was a call for a book called Digital Social Studies. And I was kind of curious about what was happening on social media. So I started investigating it. And then I started investigating. I was really surprised at all of these excited teachers who were sharing resources and ideas using the Twitter hashtag SSChat. And so I had my social studies methods students start using social media to learn in our class, to be able to gain knowledge from experts outside of our class, you know, that they weren't just limited to what I could offer. And that's where I kind of, you know, bumped into Jeff online and actually one of Jeff's students who pointed me to Jeff. And then we started doing the Twitter research to kind of understand how and why teachers were using Twitter. And so that kind of morphed into another project where Jeff and I worked with Tori Trust, who's at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And so what we wanted to understand was not just how educators used a single medium like Twitter, but how their overall PLNs, their overall professional learning networks were constructed. And so one of the studies came out of that. We were able to do a qualitative survey that we ended up getting about 732 K-12 teachers. And so what we did is we just asked them to describe and define their PLNs to see how they understood them and try to make sense of that. And so it was, we went through and coded all of that data. And our analysis just showed some of the things that we already knew, is that just kind of the anytime, anywhere availability of expansive PLNs really allowed educators to meet various needs. And so in our paper, there's a quote that we use at the beginning of the paper that I like to read because it gives a kind of an example of the ways that people conceived of their online PLNs. So this is from a teacher in Canada who is in her 6th year. She said, "The most important thing I learned from my PLN is that there is a community of enthusiastic, amazing educators that are lifelong learners, always evolving their practice and learning from each other and me. That was the kind of teacher I wanted to be, but I didn't have the best role models of this around me. Once I found these communities online, especially on Twitter, I started being that force in person as well. I encourage my colleagues to share with me and I share with them. Together we are better." And we ended up using that as kind of one of the bylines of the paper, which was called Together We Are Better, Professional Learning Networks for Teachers. And so that was published in Computers in Education in 2016. And what we really learned in that study was that, you know, everyone uses social media for different purposes. They don't use it for the exact same purpose. They get different things out of it. Some people get multiple things. Some people go in and just get single things. And so we were able to code out and identify 4 different areas that where teachers' needs were met. One of those areas was just their affective needs. And so many teachers describe their PLNs as influencing their emotions, interests, attitudes relating to teaching and learning. And so you could see a lot of times this was, for example, teachers who jumping on Twitter and sharing resources with other excited educators help to motivate them and make them feel motivated in their profession. Another category was the social needs that people have. A lot of people describe their PLNs as influencing their teaching and learning practices, and they often cited the social benefits of connecting, collaborating, and communing with other people. This can be particularly true for educators who are isolated. I think Tanya was kind of mentioning that a little bit, like how whether it's geographically isolated, intellectually isolated, or you're just the only one who teaches your subject in your school, like social media is a way where you can go and connect with other people facing similar issues. And those communal experiences can be really beneficial. We also identified cognitive needs that teachers had, just the idea that they wanted to grow their knowledge, they wanted new teaching strategies, they wanted to develop new intellectual skills. And so that was a place where they could do those things. And then finally, their identity needs. And a lot of this spanned, the effective social and cognitive aspects of their growth, where they were able to, think of who they were as a teacher. So this would be oftentimes encapsulated by teachers who would say stuff like, they saw themselves as a lifelong learner. And so it helped them shift their focus to make their students lifelong learners. And so the ways that teachers thought of themselves became really important. And so that study really showed us how, again, if you can find your affinity space online, there's a lot of possible benefits. But I think one thing that we've learned, in recent years too, is that these spaces are fragile. They can easily fall apart. They can easily be disrupted. And so there's a lot more that we have to learn about them. Some of the other research I've done has been around how we can get teacher candidates to, use social media spaces to reflect and share with each other, particularly like during a time like student teaching, where they often are isolated. They're not getting to see or talk to each other as much. And so, I've done some work on that. Then also just how do we teach about social media? What's a good pedagogy for social media? What things should we do and not do? Do we just throw students on Twitter and say, hey, start tweeting? Or are there experiences that need to be built up before and after that to make those meaningful, to help students understand, especially often when they're transitioning from, younger students often have a very social context that they've already developed, and then you ask them to do it professionally. And sometimes they don't always see the professional vision. It's often surprising to people. They assume that older students or non-traditional students struggle with using social media, but oftentimes, especially if those students hadn't used Twitter or other things before, introducing it to them professionally worked very well because they hadn't used it in a different way. It was the younger students who had developed habits and ways of using it that oftentimes I had to wrestle with more how to make those shifts. And so it's interesting how we can kind of learn what a good pedagogy looks like and how we can recognize and be responsive to our students. I think going forward, a couple of the things I've worked with, Jeff and I have worked a little bit on digital citizenship. I think it's increasingly important. One thing we wrote in a recent article is how a lot of the digital citizenship curriculum does not actually focus on citizenship issues. It's more about literacy skills. And so thinking about how we can actually talk about what does it mean to be a democratic citizen online and thinking through that. And there's a lot of work in that area. I've also got a paper that's hopefully coming out soon with Nicole D'Amico at Central Florida related to digital mindfulness. How do we help students develop mindfulness around their own practices? And once they do that, then hopefully they can help develop activities and lessons to teach their students mindfulness so that, because platforms are built to steal our attention, to make us come back for more and more. And so how do we help students start to recognize that and be in control of their own uses? So going forward, I think we all know social media has been part of a lot of civic problems that we have in our country, disruptive, dangerous, alienating conversations often happen on social media, and it can be a dehumanizing space. And so as a social studies educator, I think we've got to spend more time delving into how we create a more humane social media space. What does that mean civically? How do we push back against companies who create spaces that are very negative spaces that don't help people have conversations? And so how do we work with those types of things? It's not when our public spaces are now from, being offered by public companies. And so I think those are a lot of the things we have to think about at democratic uses and make sure that we're going in the right direction. So having said all of that, just to kind of start to finish this up, I think Ben and I came up with just 3 different ways that you can get involved in SITE. So we hope hearing from everybody and their different interests will help provide a bit of ideas about what you can do if you're interested in learning more about social media. So the first thing we have here is that you can join the SITE Social Media SIG. Come to the conference. where it's coming up here in Washington, D.C. And if you can't make it this year, then think about making it next year. But we would love to have you, join us. You can also visit, we have a social media SIG page if you just want to get a little bit more information on the site website, which is site.aace.org. And then if you go to the SIG page there, you'll find our social media SIG. And then lastly, some of us have just started tweeting with the hashtag social media ed. And so I'd like to encourage everyone, if you're thinking or talking about social media, that can be our own little affinity space to kind of continue those conversations on Twitter. So with that, hopefully today's webinar was brought some different viewpoints and helped us start thinking about what research and teaching and with social media can look like.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was fantastic. And to all of our presenters, there's a lot to learn. I'm really excited to learn more about the multi-platform research. I want to learn more about the gender dynamics in these spaces, and Dan mentioned the fragility of these spaces, the affinity spaces, the various literacies, what's the pedagogy of this? So there's lots of possibilities. And I know we're still learning. So thank you so much for sharing all of this new research. Jake, do you have any questions? I know we're running a little close to time, so I just wanted to see if there were any questions from you. And
Sure.
then, okay.
Yeah, I did. Great presentations from all of y'all. I really learned a lot. I was thinking in terms of a teacher educator who recognizes that social media is something that can be leveraged and can be very powerful. What would you recommend for a teacher educator, or how would you recommend a teacher educator who wants to start to leverage social media in his or her own practice get started?
Ooh, can I jump in with that? Is this an open question?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Go ahead, Ben.
Oh, sure. Great. Well, I actually just gave a presentation to senior pre-service teachers. So at Iowa State, our student teachers do a practicum in their senior year. I've been, the large lecture class that I was talking about is full of sophomores and juniors. And so as Dan was mentioning, oftentimes our pre-service teachers are in this very liminal space. And so they have a strong understanding of what it looks like to use social media for various social and personal reasons. They have, strong affinities, strong networks. But entering into the teaching profession can be a very transformative experience. And so it oftentimes requires a strong, purposeful shift. So I suggested that our pre-service teachers start very small. And so I suggest pre-service teachers start across each of the three top social media platforms. So one very easy way to get involved is Facebook groups. So that's a very clearly defined professional development activity. There's a lot of groups that I'm involved in as well, related to social studies teaching, related to English teaching, the humanities, etc. Many, many, many groups on Facebook. Second is the Twitter chat. So all of the things that you guys have been researching, that is a very valuable resource, as you know. Third is to experiment with some of the visual-based social media platforms like Snapchat, as well as Instagram. And so I was just suggesting that the experience and the feeling of using those for teaching and learning is so different from the others that it may be worth experimenting with. So those were the three very simple, very easy suggestions I had. I'm sure we could all offer our own.
A quick suggestion that I would offer to teacher educators who are thinking about using social media with their pre-service teachers is to not talk about it as we're using social media, but to focus on, as a beginning teacher, you need people and you need ideas. And social media is just a way to get access to more people and to more ideas than you'll ever have access to in your building. So there's going to be important mentors and resources in your building, but it's probably not going to be the case that you will become the best teacher you can be if you only ever tap into those people and those ideas that are in your building. And so social media is just a way to get access to more people and more ideas.
Yeah,
Great.
and I think, oh, I was going to just add real quickly, just also just using good pedagogy, you know, don't throw your students into something without, you know, kind of helping them along the way. So thinking about, you know, talk to them about where they're already at, and then make sure to, you know, scaffold those experiences. If they've never done a Twitter chat, maybe look at an archive together in class to understand how you can get resources, and then talk to them about their uses. Are they comfortable? Have they had any problems? What do they want from it? And so just, you know, using good pedagogy that's responsive in general can be really helpful, and making sure your students have visions of what they can do in their own classes. First thing I always do is have to convince, for example, elementary candidates, you know, oftentimes, you know, you don't, yeah, elementary kids aren't going to have their own Twitter accounts, but you can have a class account and model what you can do and use it together. And so just, you know, showing them oftentimes is one of the best ways to do it, but they'll need help along the way.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you all so much. I think that's terrific words of advice as we have new teacher educators working in this area. I can't wait to see you all at site and hear more about the exciting work you're doing. And I encourage anybody who's interested in learning more, you can connect with these folks at site. And then, of course, you can connect with them online. So we're so fortunate to have this new special interest group. And thank you so much for putting together a terrific presentation today.